King, comfort of the Spirit, true to give word president, fill us all things, treasure, blessings, and giver of life. Come and abide us and cleanse us from every impurity, and save our souls, O good. So, we're going to be doing the book of Revelation, and the introductory verse to Revelation is the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show his servants things which must shortly take place. Then a little bit later on, and you have this John who self-identifies in the text. He says, "Immediately I was in the Spirit, and behold, a throne set in heaven, and one sat on the throne, and he who sat there was like a jasper," and so forth. It's very important to understand that what we're dealing with is mystical vision. These are not, the book of Revelation is not it's not a history. It's not an objective historical recounting of things. It's rather, it's vision. It's spiritual vision. It's noetic vision. And it's essential to understand as Orthodox Christians what that means, because it's not like John was sitting there with taking notes on what Jesus did and said. This is a spiritual vision of profound rapture, and where John is taken up beyond the veil of time and space, and is shown these visions, which were the visions of Jesus. Jesus showed these visions to John, but they were Jesus's visions. This is one of the things that a lot of people do is they don't read the text carefully. They superimpose their ideas upon it. But I think one of the things that we need to do is we need to take the text very seriously and look and see what is really being said and what the context is. So, for example, if these are visions that are beyond time and space, mystical visions in the spirit, in other words, noetic vision, these were high priest. This is the realm of the high priest in the Holy of Holies, because that's what the Holy of Holies of the temple was. It was a place beyond space and time. It was an entrance into the heavenly reality, and so none of the rules of space and of this world that is defined in space and time apply. What I want to do with this class is look at all of these visions that are in this book. Look at the whole book, and look at all of the references, the main references from the Old Testament, which are many and varied. Partly, perhaps, because the author not only knew all of these works of the Old Testament and was citing them in order to convey what was otherwise inexpressible, because it was beyond human comprehension, but also to convey the absolute continuity between the old and the new, and that continuity was held not by the rabbinic Jews, but by the church. And this is a this is very of course this is very timely given what's happening over in Palestine. But it's very important to understand that there was a very sharp distinction between rabbinic Judaism, which were the Sadducees and the Pharisees at the time of Jesus, and the Hebrew people. So you had the Jews on one hand, who were the Pharisees and the Sadducees, which were socio-political religious organizations, as opposed to the Hebrews, who were the common people. And I'll get more into that. There's great continuity, of course, of this text with the prophets of the Old Testament, with Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Daniel and Zechariah. And a lot of the images from those prophets are used in the context of trying to express these noetic realities that John saw and that Jesus saw. There are also many other liturgical references, and this is both in terms of the hymnography, but also in terms of the ritual, in terms of the architecture, in terms of the practices, the liturgical practices, both of the temple, of the first temple, as well as the second temple. The first temple being the Temple of Solomon, which was destroyed in 586 BC, and the second temple, which was built around 500 BC and was destroyed in 70 AD. There's a historical setting for the Book of Revelation. Now, but it's debated among the scholars as to whether this is a book in which uses all of these symbols to describe the tension between the church and the Roman Empire, or where the great harlot city was Rome, or, and I think this is more likely, and this is the basis of my own understanding and my own sources, or that the Book of Revelation was actually, parts of it were probably actually some of the first writings of the New Testament, coming from maybe the 40s or the 50s, and being put into final form in the 60s before the fall of Jerusalem. And part of what the book is, just like Jesus was a prophet of the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple, so also the Book of Revelation depicts the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the Second Temple. It also has the vision of the restored temple, and we'll get into that. The temple that is restored by the Messiah. Which is future prophecy. Prophecy does not always mean what's going to happen in the future. Prophecy means to speak forth the word of God. So the prophets were those who spoke forth the word of God, who revealed to the people God's word, God's plan, God's judgment, which was not always very nice, to say the least. Because sometimes it was a judgment of condemnation, and very often in the prophets in the Old Testament, it was a judgment of condemnation. With the book of Revelation in particular, in fact, more than most of the other books in the New Testament, because you're dealing with visions, with spiritual visions, as opposed to historical events being described. These visions can, and because those visions are outside of time, they can be applied to a particular time when they were written, when the people who read the book when it was first published would have understood exactly what was being referred to, and who was being referred to. But it can also refer to later times. It can also refer to earlier times. There's an aspect of it that is not confined by time and space. It may be about Jerusalem in the 60s of the first century, or it may be about Rome and Jerusalem in the Rome and the church in the 90s of the first century. But it could just as well be about now, or it could be about 10,000 years from now. We don't know. But what a lot of this comes down to is that there are different types of knowledge and different types and the church has different types of teaching and levels of teaching. Now, the book of Revelation, according to the ancient tradition, is anybody under 30 is forbidden to read the book of Revelation, because they don't have the maturity to understand it. And if you look at the kind of general Protestant world, you can see that there are a million different interpretations of the book of Revelation, which very often have one main pronoun. It's I and me. It's usually first person. I think. And we're not into what I think. I think what we need to do is look at what does the text say, and how can we understand this in relationship to the prophecies of the Old Testament, in relation to the historical setting in which the book was composed, and in later times, and what the book prophesies as to the eschaton. The eschaton, just to make sure everybody understands, the word eschaton means the end times. What is the adjective is eschatological, referring to the times of the end. As I said, prophecy is not always about the future. Sometimes prophecy is even interpreting events from the past. Now, one of the things that's important to remember, and you see plenty of that in the Old Testament, is that there were true prophets and false prophets. And the true prophets were those who had these profound spiritual visions from God and related those visions, regardless of whether people understood them or not. But the false prophets usually were those who were pandering to some king or some ruler or some group, trying to get something, money or prestige or a job or something out of them. So they would tell them what their itching ears wanted to hear. Well, the Lord had some rather sharp words for false prophets. So in the church, so is this all clear so far? Make sense? Yes, no? Okay.
Yes.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So the church's teaching has multiple levels. So there's an initial level, of, probably, fourth grade Sunday school, right? Most people, and it doesn't matter whether you're Orthodox or Catholic or Baptist or Lutheran or whatever, fourth grade Sunday school or elementary grade Sunday school is probably just about the same everywhere. It's Bible stories, it's not the text, and it's, Easter is about chicken, chicks and ducks and bunnies, and Christmas is about Santa Claus, and there are people who hang on to that. I found that very often a lot of the people who are the most sophisticated in a worldly way are the least sophisticated in their spiritual life. And so basically, what you can say about that is that it's cute. Doesn't have much relationship to the scriptures, doesn't have much relationship to the faith. Then there's another level, which is teenage catechism, aimed at about 13, 14-year-olds, 15-year-olds, teenagers, early high school. And one of the things that, on a developmental level, that teenagers at this stage are basically just beginning to be able to deal with abstract thought. Usually things are very concrete in this layer of teaching. So they may actually be dealing with the text, but they tend to be very legalistic. If it says that, if it says it in the text, that must be the way it is, period. No questioning it. Dealing with very concrete things, um, uh, trying to figure out how Jesus was resuscitated, for example, all kinds of strange questions come up, and in other words, trying to fit the Christian faith into rational categories. Because this is the beginning of that kind of age of reason, for most kids. And a great number of people in the church, that was the highest level of teaching that they were ever exposed to, which is kind of sad, because it misses huge amounts of what the church is trying to say, and of what the gospel is and how to express the gospel. Then there's another stage, also immature, and that's the scholarly stage. That's where everything is, very neatly fit into rational and material categories. And this is especially since the 13th century, when rationalism began to reign in the West. And then with the Enlightenment, where there was absolute faith in reason, and with the idea that a human person could understand anything, and if you can't understand it, it's not worth understanding. If you can't feel it, if you can't measure it, if you can't touch it, if you can't see it. It doesn't exist. And what this is, it represents the radical secularization of Western culture, in which the spiritual dimension, the noetic dimension of reality is dismissed or rejected, called foolishness. This goes back to St. Paul when he says, the word of the cross is a stumbling block to the Jews and foolishness to the Greeks. But to us who are being saved, it's the power of God, and the wisdom of God. The scholarly approach is usually critical. It's a critical approach, which is not all bad. To be critical means it's about asking questions of the text. How do you understand what the text is trying to say? But then especially with graduate students, having been one, to the degree of the secularization of the program or of the students, many of whom are simply functional atheists, even though they're studying theology. And there have been whole forests full of trees that have been sacrificed to print some of the inveterate nonsense of master's and doctor's theses, doctoral theses. Just because you can, you create some, you ask a question of the text and then create an argument to justify your own solution of it, doesn't mean that it has anything to do with truth. And that's one of the things that's profoundly lacking. In the scholarly argument, because all it is, it's about people's opinions. There's one scholar, for example, that I've read a little bit of, a guy named Bart Ehrman, who hates Christianity. And yet he's a scholar of Christianity in some major university. And he writes these books which just revile and ridicule Christianity. There's nothing, and one wonders if there's anything redeemable in that. And that's because all of that is the product of the ego. It's the product of the rational mind, uninformed by faith, uninformed by noetic awareness, uninformed by a living experience of God. And it's knowledge about religion and knowledge of religion, but it has nothing to do with knowledge of God. And you can know all about religion, you can know all the sacred texts, you can know all the fathers, you can know all the rituals, all the liturgies, everything else, and still not know God. And yet you can have people whose faith is very simple and pure, and they don't know anything at all about theology or the story of the evangelicals who went to interview the babushkas coming out of an Orthodox church, just to prove themselves that these people didn't know anything, and asked one of them to explain the Trinity. And babushka said, well, it's God, Mary, and Jesus, but Jesus died, so they put in St. Nicholas. It's like, no. But that woman probably knows God. She may not be able to put it into rational terms. She certainly isn't able to put it into scholarly kinds of explanations of the Trinity and things like that, but she probably knows God. Um, and or Tolstoy's story of the three hermits, you know. Um, there's a huge problem with the rationalist reduction of a scholarly approach. Um, and this is what's in universities, this is what's in seminaries, this is what's in um, this is of the world and in the world. Now, the church's understanding of the scriptures is not this rational reduction, though it does take into account a historical understanding. It does take into account a literal understanding, but it's not chained by a literal understanding. Um, but it's also profoundly informed by the spiritual vision that the scriptures contain. And that vision um, is deeply related to this to these visions that God showed to Jesus, and Jesus then showed to John, and then John wrote them down so that we could enter into them. Um, when it comes to mysticism, which is the very nature of this kind of um, spiritual vision, it has little, if anything, to do with with some kind of a critical or historical or literal interpretation. Historically, so far as the patristic method goes, in other words, how did the early fathers understand and approach the scriptures? They had really five um, uh, methods, all of which could be used together. The first was the literal historical level of understanding of a text. The second is the moral understanding. What is this text trying to teach morally? Third level is the typologic or the symbolic level of understanding. In other words, in the text of the scriptures is full of typology. Western thought lost the idea of typology in the 13th century. The idea of the symbol changed radically at that time. Before the 13th century, it was perfectly legitimate to call the sacraments symbols, because what the word meant is that it means something that's thrown together. The two realities are held together by the in mind, and by participating in the one, you participate in the other as well. So by participating, eating the bread and wine of the Eucharist, you actually partake of the Lord's body and blood. When nominalism hit the church in the 13th century, that link was broken. Now, this is something that happened primarily in the West. The Eastern Church remained faithful to the patristic understanding and did not submit itself to the nominalist idea. But that nominalist idea has come to the point where even in the Roman Catholic Church, 60% of the faithful do not believe that the bread and wine of the Eucharist is the body and blood of Christ. And I wonder in the Orthodox Church sometimes. You know, and this is the power of rationalism and the power of this nominalism, which basically says that a thing is only what it actually is. A cup is a cup is a cup is a cup. Or the bread is simply bread. It can have a vague symbolic relationship to something else or be used as a symbol, but in and of itself, it has no participation in that other reality. And so with that, the entire sacramental system of the West started to fall apart. So 13th century was 300 years before Protestantism. So Protestantism really could not grasp the idea of the sacraments, the mysteries, because philosophically, theologically, they didn't have the tools. The link was broken. Another type of interpretation is allegorical. I think everybody here went to the Great Canon of St. Andrew during Lent. That whole canon is one long exercise in allegory. You know, I don't know. So, which is allegory has no necessary relationship to the text itself or to the literal meaning of the text. In fact, it probably doesn't have any relationship. But there's some kind of spiritual relationship because it illustrates, something like uh, the uh, the Jews in the Old Testament sinned, so I have sinned even worse than they. That's an allegorical interpretation. Only you go to somebody like St. Andrew of Crete, and um, the allegorical allegories are taken onto a high level of rhetoric. Here again, the West doesn't use allegory. St. Paul used allegory, and it's used all throughout the scriptures. It's used in the Old Testament, it's used in the New Testament. Part of what the philosophical development of the second millennium did is it destroyed the ability to understand the scriptures as previous cultures had done. So it became reduced to this, to a kind of rationalist, materialist, and dualist categories. Everything is good or bad, you know, if it's male, it's good. If it's female, it's bad. If it's white, it's good. If it's black, it's bad, and on and on and on and on and on. Which permeates Western thought. It's purely dualist because rationalism is ultimately a dualistic system. Now, there's Another
That,
category.
I have a question.
Sure.
When you're talking about rationalist system and dualist system, would you say that that's the way the Catholic theology is, or do you
Yep.
think that's like atheistic rationalism?
Well, first, at first, with the adoption of uh, Aristotelian logic, um, uh, that was you know obviously early on they still believed as Christians, um, and they still had a basic Christian worldview. Um, but what they did is they forced the theology into these philosophical forms. Um, and then they accused the East of doing the same thing that what they did with Aristotelianism that the East did with Platonism. And this is totally incorrect. It's totally wrong. Um, uh, and you can see if you read Aquinas, if you read, or I'm sorry, yeah, Thomas Aquinas, you can see if you read the scholastic thought um, that you've got these rationalist arguments that are built using Aristotelian models. That's not how the fathers of the Orthodox Church worked. Now, what's interesting is a lot of the examples that Thomas Aquinas used were quotes from the Eastern Fathers, but they were forced into this kind of straitjacket.
But
And so,
do you think he came to some truths even if he used sort of a weird method though?
well,
I don't know if weird is the way, but I don't know that that's the terminology, but more of this like Aristotelian method. Do you think even though there might be some stretching he did, that there could be some truths Aquinas came to?
I don't think he discovered any truths. He tried to prove certain truths. Like, for example, all of the great medieval um, uh, idea was to try and prove the existence of God. Well, on a rational level, you cannot do it. It doesn't work, and it doesn't convince anybody. But this was a scholastic. Think about university classes and problems given by the professor to the students to solve. Okay, that's what scholasticism ultimately comes out of.
Do you think some of the things that Thomas Aquinas argues for and maybe other topics could like he could prove things
It's
well, because he talks
some of
about he
what he
does have
argues, some of what he argues for is fine, and some of it was a bit off. Thomas Aquinas was not the biggest problem in Western theology. In fact, he was one of the last who understood the distinction between the rational mind and the nous. He called it the ratio
he,
superior and the ratio inferior. Um,
he understood the distinction between what?
the nous and the cognitive faculty. And that within 100 years of Thomas's death, that was pretty much gone in the West. Not entirely, but for the most part.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I know
Mhm.
he also supposedly had a vision at the end of his life where he basically had there is in this account he had a mystical vision and he said everything I've written is almost like dust or whatever he said.
Straw. He said it was straw to be burned, and and that's where you can say, well, Thomas Aquinas was a holy man, undoubtedly, to have that vision, because because the point is that spiritual vision is higher than any rational arguments. It transcends any rational process and conclusions. And the basic premise is that the cognitive faculty, the brain, the rational mind, can only go so far. The way that the idea developed over the course of the first millennium came to the so-called Enlightenment in the 18th century, which basically asserted that the rational mind, that the human mind can understand anything. And we say, no, that's not true. That it comes to a point where all we can do is stand in awe before the mystery of God. And this is where, this is where apophatic theology comes in as an essential balance to cataphatic theology. Cataphatic means you describe things positive with positive language. God is good. God is holy. God is great. God is so on and so forth. Whereas in apophatic language, you say, or we say, like in the liturgy, God is ineffable, inconceivable, invisible, incomprehensible. In other words, utterly beyond our ability to understand or grasp him. And so I think this is something really essential, because this is ultimately what, and that distinction was developed by Dionysius the Areopagite. Now, many scholars think that he lived in the 5th or the 6th century. I tend to go for the earlier date, that he actually was the philosopher on the Areopagus in Athens that became a disciple of St. Paul. And that his categories were not simply the Neoplatonic or Aristotelian or whatever but rather that they were the wisdom of the first temple, going back to Pythagoras, who had gone to Jerusalem and had been taught by the priests of the first temple, which is very interesting, to say the least. Pythagoras was one of the earliest of the Greek philosophers, and that tradition got passed on. But it makes great sense. There may have been somebody later on who put the writings of Dionysius into the current form, but I think the tradition goes back to him.
I guess I'll just comment real quick about like not understanding everything.
Uh-huh.
I guess like normally like we would maybe associate that like with fear and like worry, like oh no, something's bad. But recently, I think I went like to a church and like saw like a quote saying, "With God, anything is possible." And I think linked to that is like a very hopeful message as well. So like for example, we have like the Trinity, right? So it's like three different parts, but all together they're one God. And like mathematically, that's like really hard to comprehend, and we can't really understand that.
Right.
At the same time, you think of the phrase "all things are possible," even like three and one is possible. I think that in some sense kind of sheds some light into that darkness of not understanding, knowing that hey, anything can be possible. God can really work miracles. I thought that's a pretty cool connection.
Yeah. And part of what that is that whereas all rational thought is basically in terms of a dualistic worldview. That's just how you know even computers work on it. on a dualist system, it's either on or off, right? That's what coding is all about, right? It's all about, these little whatever they are, chits or whatever, being on or off, and that's how all the messages are encoded. But that's how ultimately how our minds work rationally. It's of this world. But there's another aspect of this, and this is spiritual or noetic consciousness that is not dualistic, but it's rather non-dual. So the Trinity is a non-dual concept, 3 and 1. How do we understand that? You can there are all the major Trinitarian heresies are reducible to people trying to understand it in dualistic terms. Whether it comes to Arianism, whether it comes to modalism, whether it comes to the filioque heresy, whether it comes to all of these things historically became the fodder for trying to put them into dualistic categories, and it doesn't work because it distorts everything. But rather, non-dual awareness is also not something that is of our rational mind. It's noetic awareness, which transcends the categories of this world. It transcends rational knowledge. It transcends the attempt and ability to explain things. In other words, it's an entrance into an apophatic state of awareness, where we silence our minds and and we open up our spiritual consciousness, which is able to be aware of and perceive these mysteries. This is what spiritual vision is. It's the silencing of the rational mind and opening up our spiritual awareness so that becomes primary, so that we can experience God. I love the quote of St. Isaac the Syrian, who was asked, what is salvation? And he said, it's consciousness in God. Now, we so often want to reduce it into a dualistic category, that there's God and there's me, and somehow God is enlightening my mind so that I can catch a glimpse of God's vision or something. That's not it at all. But rather, it's being caught up into spiritual awareness, into noetic awareness, so that we become aware in God, so that our consciousness is transformed. And this is the goal of repentance, which means being transformed in the renewal of our nous, of our spiritual awareness. It's Romans 12:2. Now, When it comes to the scriptures, as well as to well-written theological texts, there's yet another aspect of interpretation that's called anagogy. I'll put it in the notes. It's anagogical. If you look in the chat, I just put the word in there. And what it means is to lift up. And this area of anagogical understanding of the text, or of any text, or of a liturgy or whatever, means essentially that the text elevates our understanding beyond the rational mind into the level of noetic vision, called theoria. Theoria, it means vision. And so it's crucial to understand that this is the absolute intersection between religion and spirituality. Real religion, dealing with texts and liturgies and services and concepts and more concepts and images and stuff. It's all on the material level. It's all on the level of the rational mind. Because what does it use? It uses concepts, conceptual images, as Maximus calls them, as of visual images, of ritual images, of all of these things. And I'm not saying that these are bad, but what they're there to do is that they elevate our awareness so that we can enter into living experience of communion with God, which is beyond thought, beyond images, and beyond our rational consciousness. In other words, when we pray these texts, whether it be the scriptures or whether it be liturgical texts or something else, it lifts us up from a prayer of thought and image and concept into contemplation of the living God, the contemplation of grace, the contemplation of the uncreated light. And for those who are the most advanced, the very contemplation of God himself, who is beyond all conception. So does this make sense? Yes, no?
As clear as I can understand.
Okay.
Yes. Yes, I'm getting there.
Okay. So, what happened in the West was a kind of a radical reduction of the faith to religion, to form and concept, without the spiritual corrective. Now, in the monastic tradition in the West, just as in the East, to a great extent, they were able to hold on. So the Carmelites, the Cistercians, the Trappists, the Benedictines, held on to the mystical theology of the undivided church. At least they did for centuries until they got overrun.
What about the Dominicans?
Dominicans are the ultimate example of um, of uh, Thomistic rationalism. Now, I'm not saying the Dominicans are bad, but as a movement, um, it was one of the things that crushed the monastic tradition in the West. The friars, the Dominicans, the Franciscans, then later the Jesuits, and then all sorts of other kinds of orders. On the other hand, there were some Dominicans who were great mystics. But by the 15th century, 16th century, the Latin Church was bitterly persecuting mystics. So the Carmelites, such as St. John of the Cross, St. Teresa of Avila, they spent years in prison because they thought they were heretics. But yet, a lot of what they write resonates with Orthodox thought, or what they wrote resonates with Orthodox thought.
It's interesting to think about that though, because now like the Catholics would say, we love John of the Cross. and,
Well, now they do.
and like
They virtually killed him, you know, with the Inquisition and all of that nonsense. And it was the Dominicans who were in charge of the Inquisition. So, the biggest challenge, though, you know, what happened over the course of the second millennium, with the growth of reduction to rationalism, was radical secularism and the complete compartmentalization of the religious and the spiritual from daily life, to the point where by the time of the Enlightenment, and just as the world now, you know, thinks now in contemporary categories, people live in complete denial that there is a spiritual dimension of life. Everything is somehow materialist. In fact, the basic presupposition of secularism is atheism. And in fact, it's secularism that is the greatest enemy of Christianity. It doesn't matter whether it's communist or capitalist. It's all the same thing. And it's the assertion of the human reason over and above the spirituality and spiritual understanding. Now, for us as Orthodox, reason is good because it's also an aspect of the image of God within us, that we have the ability to reason. But it's limited. I can only go so far until it hits that apophatic boundary, when all that we can do is go into noetic awareness and contemplation. Mystery is something that we as Orthodox Christians are very comfortable with. And the idea of mystery is not just that which is beyond human understanding. It really ultimately implies that it's something that can be only perceived noetically. Okay. Does everybody know what I mean when I say noetic?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So this all makes sense? Okay.
Yes.
All right. So um, when we talk about the book of Revelation, what we're talking about is noetic vision. We're not, it's not like the synoptic gospels of, which are basically just historical accounts of Jesus. And then St. John, of course, is theological. And you talk about an anagogical work. Try meditating on, and contemplating using the Gospel of St. John as the basis for your contemplation. I mean, it'll take you up into heaven. But so will the book of Revelation. Um, so what we're going to be doing with this is we're going to look at it both in terms of what's the literal historical context, and what did it mean to the people that would have read it when it was written. We'll look at the symbols that are used, the and the images that are being used in Revelation, relating them to their original use by the prophets. And prophetic vision, by the way, is precisely noetic vision, right? The real prophets perceived God noetically, spiritually, and were able to speak forth, which is the word prophecy. They were able to speak forth his word, his words to us. We'll look at the liturgical aspect and see how exactly what happened with St. John, especially when we get to chapter 4, is precisely a description of an anagogical, or it's precisely a description of anagogy. When he says, I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day, in other words, I was in church on Sunday, and using the images of the liturgy with the priests and the deacons and the Eucharist going on around him, he was transported to heaven and saw through the earthly symbols, the earthly types, to the heavenly archetype. Actually, through the earthly antitypes to the heavenly archetype. And thus was able to behold these mysteries which are beyond what the eye can see and the ear can hear. So So does anyone have any questions? Yes.
What is our homework before the next meeting?
Well, I would suggest read the first chapter.
First chapter.
Of Revelation, yeah. If you have a, there's, even if everybody's using the Orthodox Study Bible or some of these, it's going to have, in other words, use a Bible that has notes. Now, some of the best notes, are in this. There's also a series, and you can see the image here of that series, Ancient Christian Commentaries. That also has patristic commentaries. Whoop. You can't see that.
What was that book you held up just now, Ladika?
Okay, that's the Orthodox New Testament from Holy Apostles Convent.
Thank you.
Oops, that's not what I want. Okay, that looks right. If you have the either the Logos Bible study module for the computer or Accordance, Accordance is a little easier to use. Logos is more complex and also much more sophisticated and a lot more expensive. But for example, you can get this ancient Christian commentary and have access to it as it parallels the text. So it's really useful. It's really useful to have either Accordance or Logos. Of course, with Logos, you can be looking at laying out $1,500. With Accordance, it's much less expensive. Okay, Alex.
Yes, if I could just add a thought. Toward the end, you were talking about mystery, and it brings to mind that you look historically where scholasticism kind of took over in the West, and that was somewhat in parallel with physics taking over from Newtonian mechanics becoming the end all and it could explain everything. And then from a physics perspective, that changed last century with quantum mechanics and first with, we talked about dualism. Well, photons confused people for a long time because they couldn't fit into a dualistic perspective. It wasn't either a particle or a wave, it was both. Mm-hmm. And then, later on with cosmology and modern quantum mechanics, you get into really some crazy stuff about entanglement where particles, forever away from each other somehow know each other. So there's mystery in modern physics that leads to humility for honest physicists. And I wonder whether that isn't a encouraging development from a, religion, philosophy, theology perspective, that maybe this sense of mystery from a physics perspective could provide some insight or support for the fact that everything you were saying, that ultimately this is not a rational, or rational thought isn't sufficient to get to the essence of God.
Right. Yeah. I think it's very interesting, how this, how the ideas of quantum mechanics, have been taken up, as it were, a lot of times in the New Age movement, but also I think there are some serious, I'm sure there are some serious Orthodox thinkers that are looking at quantum mechanics. I know there's interest. So it'll be interesting to know what the Russians are doing with it, because they have quite a they're not as hidebound as American secularism. I think they escaped that once the Soviet Union fell.
Well, and there's an element of arrogance, right? If you're convinced that I can explain everything just by thinking about it, you build a picture of yourself that's, frankly unrealistic and ultimately doesn't work.
Yep, exactly.
Adding to that thought, Alex, I just listened to a podcast by Dr. Jerome Corsi talking about the investigation into the Shroud of Turin and the new information that has come forth about that, with them being able to type the type of dirt that was in the shroud and the type of blood and but also physicists trying to replicate that image and being completely incapable of doing it because we don't have the power of the light source or the energy to capture an image like that. And it just speaks to, again, how sad it is that we are struggling so much to justify something and rationalize something so it can be believed and accepted, instead of just accepting it as a wonderful gift given to us of the image of Christ in the moment of his transfiguration and ascension into heaven.
Amen.
Yeah. But it just speaks again to our own arrogance, right? We still, in the West, I think we're so caught up in needing a justification or an explanation for everything. And I think myself, coming from a STEM background, I struggle to let that go and just be in a place of complete acceptance, right? Because that's kind of brainwashing in the West. We've been inculcated with this idea that we have to have an explanation for everything, instead of just opening up our hearts and minds and just being, it is what it is,
Yeah.
The only thing I could add to that is because I've been doing study and debates and funny things like quantum mechanics, and I've done a lot of debates in my Protestant life from a lot of this stuff when it came to, like, Metropolitan Jonah was talking about rationalizing God and trying to prove him. Well, I can definitely say I'm guilty in that, but how the mindset specifically here in the West and in secularism, how they get around all of this, their biggest argument and actually their God is time. And it's one of the unfortunate events of Darwinism is if when there isn't something explained and there is a great mystery, something like what quantum mechanics is giving, the end all argument is we haven't figured it out yet because we just need X amount of billion years or whatever time. It's just given enough time, the right technology will come along and we too will grow as gods, is usually how they get around all arguments and try to step away from it all so they can still live as they are.
Hope springs eternal.
That's true.
Well, go ahead.
It sounds like it's going to be an interesting series of classes. I'm really looking forward to it, and I think it's going to be quite revelatory.
Well, I hope so. I mean, it's, I'm learning just as much as anybody else is. So, all right.
Thank you so much, Flanica, for sharing your time with us, and for everyone else. It's been wonderful to meet you.
You're welcome. So Alex, it's this weekend we have the news talk, right? On Sunday?
No, that got postponed to June 16th. Yeah.
Ah,
June
that's
16th.
that's good because my paper's not quite ready yet. It's like, I was thinking, oh no, I was freaking out.
Yeah, there were a number of conflicts, and we decided to postpone it to middle of June, June 16th.
Okay, excellent. All right, so God bless you. Let's pray. Shine, shine in New Jerusalem. The glory of the Lord is shown on thee. Exult and be glad. Be radiant, O most pure Theotokos, in the resurrection of thy Son. O Christ, great and holy Pascha, wisdom, word, and power of God, grant that we ever more perfectly may partake of thee in the never-ending day of thy kingdom. The blessing of the Lord be upon you through his grace and love for mankind, always now and ever into ages of ages.